But tonight, we are really excited to have Deane Barker join us here to talk about content migrations. This is a super timely topic for me personally. My team is actually embarking on a migration, so I'm looking forward to getting some great advice and take that back to my team. If anyone doesn't know Deane, he is one of the leaders in this space, content management space, been doing this for about 25 years, working in professional services. You might have heard a few minutes ago, he's talking about Blend Interactive, an agency that he was, did you found that, Deane?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. Now he works as the Senior Director of Content Management Strategy at Episerver, which is a content management system. So I'm going to hand it over to Deane. Just a little logistics thing here. If you have questions, put them in the chat, and we'll get to the questions at the end, and we'll kind of go through and let you have a chance to ask your questions when the presentation is over. Thanks, everybody. And Deane, over to you.
Awesome. Can you guys see my screen? Thumbs up?
Yes.
Good. Awesome. Hey, thanks for having me. This is my second time speaking at this meetup. I spoke in person 7 years ago in Seattle. Paula, we were in the back of a pizza restaurant, I think.
Yep. Pikora's, the late lamented Pikora's on.
And I must have done a great job because 7 years later, here I am. So, thank you for having me. I was just saying I was since COVID started, the only traveling I've done. I actually got COVID in September. And so once I recovered from that and was immune, my father lives in Renton, Washington. So the only trip I've made in like the last year is to fly to Renton to visit my 79-year-old father for about 3 days just before the election. So I am really happy to be here. I'm going to talk about a topic that I weirdly enjoy about content migrations. This is based on a university course that I do. I have no design skill or talent. I'm a disaster. So this deck was the most boring black and white deck. And I thought, well, I'm going to have these like sophisticated content strategy design people on. I'm like, I have to make this deck not awful. So you may be looking at this deck saying, it looks like someone took a deck and applied a default PowerPoint theme to it. And if that is what you're thinking, I'm going to assure you that, yes, that is exactly what I did. And so hopefully my deck is somewhat presentable for you, but I have no design talent whatsoever. This is me. I'm on the camera here too. My name is Deane Barker. I have an E in the end of my name. I have no idea why. I'm the Senior Director of Content Management Strategy at Episerver. Episerver is one of, I would say, the big four of web CMS. And actually, of course, now we're doing headless and digital experience. But we're kind of up there with Sitecore and Adobe and Aqua Drupal. I planned the content management aspect of the product. The CMS belongs to me. I used to be a co-founder and a partner at a company called Blend Interactive here in Sioux Falls. I live in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And I founded that company about 15 years ago. We were a system integrator. We did content management integrations, quite a few of them with Episerver before I went to work for Episerver. And the reason why I bring that up, I actually don't work at Blend anymore. I actually have no connection with them anymore, except all of the migration experience I have really came from 15 years of professional services working at Blend. So a lot of what I'm going to show you here is really based on my experience in professional services. I write a lot. I've written 4 books about different aspects of CMS. The one on the left there was the O'Reilly book about web content management. About 2 years ago, I wrote a book about content modeling, which is something I really enjoy. Just last year, the third book over there is about selecting content technology, like selecting CMSs. If you're going to select a CMS, like these are the things you should know. And then on the far right, this is what I'm really excited about. This is going to come out this summer. I wrote this with Corey Vilhauer, who's the head of strategy at Blend. The web project guide, it's a look at the entire process we used at Blend, the 24-stage process of kind of implementing a content managed website. And it's online. We actually wrote it online. If you go to webprojectbook.com, I'll have the URL for you. In the end, the entire book is actually online. And the reason why I bring this up is because if at the end of this talk, you're like, I have not heard Deane drone on enough, then there is a whole chapter on migrating content. There's like 7,000 words out there about migrating content, which will echo a lot of the things I'm going to tell you here. So if you haven't got enough of me, please go out there and check that out. This is like I said, on a college course I do, Paula actually teaches in the same program. This is a university in Austria. They offer one of the very few, maybe the only master's degree in content strategy. I teach 2 courses there. I teach the Introduction to CMS course, and I teach advanced topics in content management. And the deck I'm going to run through tonight is really based on, it's kind of last lecture of that intro course. It's based on that. I've elaborated a bit, but fundamentally what we're going to be talking about is content migrations. But let's start by defining what migration means. And you may think that this is really elementary, but I'm about to have some anecdotes for you that's going to explain why this is important. A migration, as we're talking about in this talk, is the movement of content from one platform to another. And that's very important. It's the movement of content from one platform to another. It assumes you have 2 content management systems, and you just need to get the content out of one, and you need to get it in and working in the other. And this is very important to understand. The major point here is that a build is not the same as a migration. Okay, once you build a new house, right, you have to move all your stuff into it. And you may be looking at this and thinking, well, sure, this makes total sense. But I'm going to give you 2 stories why this is very important for you to establish. When some people talk about the word migration, they think that includes building the new website on the new CMS. And this has happened to me not once, but twice. I'm embarrassed to say it happened a second time. The first time was about 10 years ago. We were talking about a company. We were talking to them. We were kind of scoping their project. And it turned out that it became obvious during the scoping phase of this project that they thought in the process of moving the content out of their old CMS, we were actually going to configure and build out the new CMS. And we managed to head that one off before the project started. We said, look, you don't understand. We're assuming you're going to build this thing out. And I remember thinking we like dodged a bullet there. I actually wrote a blog post saying migration might be the most dangerous word in CMS, because like a misunderstanding of what that word means can be disastrous. But 4 years ago, we were subcontracting through another organization to do this migration work. And we had done some test extractions, which I'll talk about in a little bit when I get into more process-oriented stuff. But we had done some test extractions, and I had an update call. I had just landed in Chicago, and I was walking through O'Hare, and I remember I was walking through the baggage claim to get to an Uber, and I still remember this vividly. And the client wanted to know when they were going to get to see some of their content. And I said, well, when will you have the new website ready for us to migrate content into? And there was a long pause that went on like a beat too long. And that's when I realized, to my horror, I remember exactly where I was. I realized that they didn't build the website. They thought we were going to do that. And we were subcontracted through another organization. So the whole thing turned into a big mess. But long story short, you need to establish this. If you load all your furniture in a moving truck and you send that moving truck on its way down the street, you need to make sure that moving truck has a house to go to and to unload all that stuff. So when we are assuming you have built the new house, and we're just moving your stuff into it. And why does this matter? This largely matters because I would say that 90% of projects these days are really rebuilds. At Blend, I don't know if it was the mix of projects we got, but very rarely did we ask to create a website, a brand new website. I mean, 90% of projects that came in the door were, there was an existing website and they just wanted to rebuild that or fix it or redesign it or whatever. Now, what this means is with a rebuild, you have content somewhere. Content's going to move. With a new project, people are going to create content from scratch. So they're going to sit down the new CMS and start typing stuff in, which is a known quantity. Like, I'm not saying that's less work, but you know you're going to have to do all that. With a rebuild, you have content somewhere and it's going to have to move. The next slide, I'm gonna make a statement that if you've ever done a migration, you will understand this deeply down to your bones. But for anyone who has not done a migration, here's the dirty secret about migrations, is that they are chronically underestimated in terms of both schedule and budget. No matter how much time and how much budget you have allotted to your migration, it hasn't been enough. I swear it hasn't been enough. I have seen many projects where the project was really a migration project with a very small development component attached to it. Like, the development of the new website was maybe 20% of the project. 80% of the project was migrating all the old content over. it can be a very, very big deal. We just had a recent one. I have some examples in here from one of the last ones I did, which was for a lobbying organization. And I'll tell you who it was because you'll see the URL in there. It was the National Association of Federal Credit Unions. And they are it's a lobbying organization. So if you're a federal credit union, you belong to this NAFQ, it's called. And you belong to NAFQ and you subscribe, you pay them, I don't know, $10,000 a year or whatever. And they lobby for you in Washington. And they develop information products. One of the things you get from belonging to this organization is you get an enormous amount of news about the federal credit union space. Information is what they're about. It's the reason why they exist. They had something like 6,000 news or 16,000 news updates in their old CMS. Like, this is not trivial content. This is literally the lifeblood of the organization. That content has to get to the new CMS. It's not like you can just turn on a new CMS and disregard everything that's happened before. Like, you need to respect your content. If you created that content for a reason, certainly throw away as much as you can so you don't have to migrate it. But content that's got to migrate, don't skimp on that. Understand that you have enough schedule and enough budget for it. The next point that's also important to understand is that every migration is custom to some extent. A lot of people make a lot of promises about how they can like bottle a migration or make it automatic. I'm very, very skeptical about this. And the reason for that is there are a lot of CMSs you could migrate from, and there are a lot of CMSs you could migrate to. And the fact is there is no grand unified theory of CMS. People have for years tried to come up with one. Like, can't we all get together on how we model content? Like, I've advocated for this for years. But every CMS models content a little bit differently. They all aggregate content a little bit differently. They assign URLs, they assign permissions, workflows, templates, all of these things a little bit differently. There's not a whole lot of overlap from one CMS to another. Now, in some cases, from a commodity CMS to a commodity CMS, and when I say commodity, I mean very, very popular, almost they become a commodity. Like if you were going to migrate from WordPress to Drupal, maybe there might be some scripts out there that would ease that for you because there's so many people using WordPress and there's so many people using Drupal. But if you're migrating from, you know, an off-brand CMS to a mainstream CMS or something, there's not going to be an automatic way to do it. So every CMS is somewhat custom because there is no grand unified theory. There have been some attempts to make common protocols, things like JCR or CMIS, but there's just not. Every CMS does things the same way or a different way. And I always look at cars. You know, on the left, you have a Toyota Corolla. And on the right, you have a Ford F-150. Well, these are both vehicles. They both have engines and transmissions and four wheels, and they both carry humans and move them down the road. But what if someone told you, hey, let's take that engine out of that Corolla and stick it in that F-150? I mean, could you do that? Theoretically, you could get a Corolla engine running in an F-150, but it would take a shocking amount of custom work. And this is the story of every content migration, right? You can't just drop a Corolla engine to an F-150 and expect it to work. If you want to do it, you could theoretically get it done, but it's going to take a lot of custom work. And that's the story of really every content migration. So let's just baseline really quick. Like when we look at a content management implementation, all of the things that go into an implementation, what can we actually migrate? So these are all the different things, and this is probably not even a comprehensive list, but these are like all the different things that go into making up a content management implementation, right? You have content models, which are your definitions. You have content objects, which is the actual content. You have the relationships between those objects. You have the different languages the content exists in. You have the language rules. Like a lot of CMSs have very complex localization rules about how they fall back through different languages. You have what I call intra-repo rich text links. That's when inside the HTML of a content object, you link to another content object in the same repository. That gets complicated because your URLs are probably going to change, which is the next thing. You have URLs and URL assignments. You have users and permissions and templates and workflows and versions. Every content may have old versions. And then you have page compositions. A lot of these systems will let you drag assets around and kind of organize and visually compose a page. Well, that visual composition really constitutes a migratable entity in some sense. So what can we actually migrate? Now, looking at this slide, I'm not saying you can migrate all this stuff. I'm going to have some handy color-coded icons. Can you migrate your content models? Probably. Good chance you can migrate those. Content modeling, a lot of aspects of content model are similar from CMS to CMS. Like most content management systems have the concept of content types. And those content types have some concept of properties or attributes. I wrote a whole book on this. If you read my content modeling book, I have like 27 different aspects of how a CMS might model content. And a lot of CMSs overlap to the point where theoretically you could migrate some content modeling definitions. You could map one to another. What about the actual content objects and also assets based on those content objects? I probably should have put assets on its own line, but theoretically, yes, you can migrate those. I mean, that really is the content. If you can migrate the content model, you can probably migrate over the content objects. Now, the rest of this talk, I'm going to get into very procedural and technical detail about all the different things you've got to do to get that done. But theoretically, yeah, you can do that. Content relationships, so how one piece of content relates to another. For instance, if your content's in like a content tree, can you migrate that tree? Usually, there's usually API and code hooks that you can figure that stuff out. You can usually migrate languages as well, because that's usually just another version of a content object. So those top four, we're usually in pretty good shape. After that, things get a little sketchy. Can you migrate language rules? Maybe or maybe not. A language rule is how your content management system falls back through languages. An example of this would be, we worked with a client in Toronto. They had some content they wanted to present in French. Or no, they wanted to present in French Canadian. And then if they didn't have French Canadian for that object, but they did have French, they wanted to fall back to French. If they didn't have French Canadian or French, they wanted to fall back to English. So they had this series of kind of fallback rules. Well, every CMS might not support that. The CMS you're going to may not support that, and you may have to completely figure out a new way to do that. If it does support that, is there a way to migrate language rules from one system to another? I don't know. I've never done it. I don't think it's very common. Intra-repository rich text links. We'll talk about this a little later in the talk. Sometimes it gets complicated. The fact is, if content object A is linking to content object B in HTML, and it's just linking to the raw URL, you may have a problem because your URLs are probably going to change. Which leads me to the next one. Can you migrate all your URL assignments? Like, will a certain article having a URL in your source CMS have the same URL in your target CMS? Usually not. Could you force it? Like, could you write some custom code to make sure it keeps the same URL? Yes, but that might, 5, 6, 7 years down the road, you might regret that you did that. I mean, if you're forcing your new CMS to act like your old CMS, then that could lead to all sorts of problems. Usually you do a redirection scheme. Users, you can usually migrate user information like first name, last name, username and stuff. The thing you usually can't migrate is their password. Passwords are not normally stored in clear text. And so you're not going to be able to get their password. So you can migrate their account, but everyone's going to have to reset their password. And that becomes a problem. Technically, it's not that much of a problem, but it becomes a problem because you're going to have to send all your users an email and say, hey, you're going to have to change your password. And you're going to have to convince them this is not like a phishing attempt. It becomes a social engineering problem. Can you migrate permissions? Yeah, maybe. If you can migrate users and you can get them into groups and your new CMS does permissions the same way as your old CMS, can you migrate all the permissions? Maybe. Can you migrate templates? Usually not. When I have a red X here, it doesn't necessarily mean you can't, just it's pretty rare. Can you migrate templates? Usually not. Most CMSs use different templating languages. Additionally, they probably model content differently. So the actual templating code that you wrote just wouldn't make sense from one CMS to another. So you're usually going to have to redo all the templates. And that's usually not terrible because a lot of migrations, you're redesigning the site anyway, so you got to retemplate it anyway. Can you migrate workflows? Not usually. Different CMSs differ wildly on how their workflows work. Some have actual workflows, some just have like approval chains. And then even if you can, a lot of them don't have code hooks for you to work with workflows automatically. It's normally something you just configure from the UI. So pretty rare that you can migrate workflows. What about versions of content? What if like you have a content object that has 47 different past versions? Can you migrate those? No, I'm going to say flat no. I haven't known any CMS where you could do that. And the reason for that is most CMSs are set up so you can't just randomly create a version. I mean, a version is literally created when the content is saved. So if you wanted to migrate the entire version history for a piece of content, you would essentially just have to start with the old version and just keep saving over it. So basically fake that entire version trail. And even though you've done that, you're still going to lose all the timestamps because they're not going to be stamped the same way. So you have to understand if you're moving from one CMS to another, you're probably throwing away your entire version history, your entire audit history. That's probably not going to come over. And then visual and page compositions. I have never seen these migrate. The way that different CMSs do page composition is so wildly different. I don't, there is no common standard or protocol for this. So usually you can. So if you look at this list, I mean, the green check marks, we're in pretty good shape. And that's really what we're going to talk about in this process here. The yellow question marks, maybe, maybe not. The red X's, very, very much not likely. You're usually just going to recreate those from scratch. So the title of this talk is The 3 Questions of a Content Migration. And here's how I always frame this. There are really 3 questions that you have to ask. And you are content strategists, and I normally give this talk to content strategists in training. And so I'm going to talk about these 3 questions and then how much it is your problem as a content strategist. If you're a developer or something, it's going to be different. But if you're a content strategist, I'm going to explain how much of this is your problem. So the 3 questions of a content migration. The first one is the editorial question. The editorial question is, what content is migrating and how does it have to change? And this is your problem. If you are a content strategist, you have to figure this out. Your old CMS has a whole bunch of content in it, and you have to figure out what of that content is migrating and how does it have to change on the way over. Like editorially, how is it going to fit in the new CMS? What are you going to keep? What are you going to throw away? Does it have to change on its way over? That's the editorial question. This is your problem. The next one is what I call a functional question, which is how will the content work in the new CMS? Remember my analogy about the Toyota Corolla and the F-150? Okay, so you're going to take the engine out of the Corolla and put it in the F-150. What do you have to do to get that to work? Well, you're probably going to have to build an adapter for the transmission, and you're probably going to have to build new engine mounts, and you're going to reconfigure all the wiring. First of all, terrible idea. Second of all, you would have to do an enormous amount of work to get this done, and that's what you have to figure out. There's no button you can push that just says file, import content. You're going to have to figure this out. You're going to have to go through your old website piece by piece by piece and figure out what is this thing doing and how am I going to do that in the new CMS? Because there's an enormous amount of functionality like in your old content management implementation, which is almost custom applications. And you have to figure out, like, does my new CMS even support that? Does it support it out of the box? Does it have to be built from scratch? This all has to be scoped. And then the last question is the procedural question. Like once we figured out what's moving and once we figured out how we're going to fit it all in over there, well, the procedural question becomes, how do we move the actual bytes from one system to another? And the functional question, that's partially your problem. You will do that in accompaniment with developers that are experts in the new system, because they'll have to answer questions about how it's all going to work. The procedural question is really somebody else's problem, but let's be serious, it's going to end up being your problem because you're the one who's going to be planning this thing out, and people are going to dump stuff in your lap. So let's make the analogy here of moving house. So if we're going to move from one house to another, the editorial question about moving house is, what are we going to move? You might just say, we're going to move everything. And that's a very simple answer. Awesome. But you know what? When you move, you throw a bunch of stuff away. I have not moved house in 21 years. God willing, I'll never move house again. My wife and I are staying here for the rest of our lives. But if you have moved house, you know, not everything goes from one house to the other. You throw a bunch of stuff out. Additionally, you have to buy some new stuff, right? You're going to have to figure out what content am I missing for the new website? What content do we need to create? If the answer to the editorial question is just everything is moving, well, awesome. Okay, I hope that works out. But usually you decide you're not going to move this old ratty couch that's in the basement that nobody sat on for years. We're going to throw that out. The functional question is, where is all our furniture going to go in the new house? So you need to look at all your furniture in the old house, and then you need to go walk through your new house and ask yourself, well, where is this all stuff all going to go? You know, the couch won't fit on that wall. So where are we going to put the couch? And then, well, if we put the TV on that wall, then there's a glare through the window and we can't watch the TV. So do we need to get new blinds for the window? I mean, there's all sorts of questions you have to answer. The procedural question is, once you've decided what furniture is moving and where that furniture is going to go in the new house, the procedural question is, how are we going to do this? We're going to rent a moving truck? We're going to borrow a pickup truck? We're going to get all our friends over here on a Saturday? Are we going to move little stuff for like 3 weeks in advance and then have one big Saturday move? You know, how are we going to get all the utilities running? These are like the nuts and bolts question of like, how is this actually going to happen? And what is the moment when we can say that we've actually moved? Like, when do we redirect our postal mail? And when do we like change over all our utilities? So that's the editorial, the functional, and the procedural questions, which I think are the 3 questions that everybody has to answer about a content migration. The first thing is a content inventory. And I actually feel kind of weird doing this because, Paula, don't you teach a course on this? Isn't this like your course, Paula? Okay, I feel
sorry. I had to unmute myself. Yes. Well, I teach on inventories and audits, and okay, well, that's what my book is about.
This is going to be a pale imitation of what Paula teaches, but you have to do an inventory. I mean, you have to develop a list of all the content on the existing site. And then I think the most important part of any content inventory in preparation for migration is you have to figure out how much content can be thrown away, because let me tell you something. The easiest content to migrate is content that you delete. That's the easiest content to migrate. If you can delete it, do that. If you're migrating an intranet, I guarantee 90% of that can be deleted and nobody will ever notice. Intranets are just notorious for old content. So often, this is more often than you think. You can delete more of it than you think, but prepare for it to get political. Whenever you do an inventory and you plan for a migration, ask yourself, like, who is the C-level executive that we can bring in here to arbitrate disputes? Because you may go to Bob and say, Bob, we're not going to bring over your section of the website, and Bob might throw a fit. Who's going to sit Bob down and say, look, this is happening whether you like it or not? So you need to kind of figure that part out. The resulting list is really a definitive list of all the specific content that needs to migrate. You need to have a list of all the different content. You need to kind of have it grouped. Like, these are all the articles. These are all the news releases. These are all the employee bios. This is all the content that's coming over. Beware of the monolithic spreadsheet. I see this happen too often. People have like a big Excel document that they keep passing around and nobody knows who has the latest version of it, and they open it all up at the same time. Beware of the monolithic spreadsheet. There are tools, one of which used to be owned by Paula, right? Didn't content analysis tool? The new one that's on the market right now is a tool called Content Chimera by a guy named David Hobbs. He's done a lovely job with that. Content Chimera is a tool designed really for you to plan content inventories and what content moves. There are tools that do this. So maybe look into some of those. But the problem with a content inventory in preparation for migration is really record keeping. Get everybody on the same page. So everybody agrees, like, this is the gospel single source of truth for everything that's going to be migrated. So you need to do this inventory. Now, here's a really important point about inventories that I see people make the same mistake all the time. Content inventory can and should start long before the implementation is underway, because the inventory is absolutely not dependent on the new CMS. You have people that say, well, you know, we'll do a content inventory after we've picked a new CMS. Why? You've got to do the inventory either way. In fact, you should start your content inventory when somebody walks into your office and says, hey, we're thinking about migrating the website. Start your inventory then. You don't need to know anything about the new website. You don't need to know anything about the new CMS or anything. You can start inventorying your content right away. In a perfect world, you've implemented like a rolling inventory so that you're kind of constantly inventorying your website. That's idealistic, and it never quite happens. Usually, like, this is like a brand new inventory. You have to start from scratch, but just don't wait. You don't need to wait for anything. You can start inventorying right away and deciding what content's going to move or not. The only thing that would affect that is if you're engaging like a marketing or a strategy firm to develop a strategy for the new website. There may be future decisions about sections of the new website and what content's going to be populated, but you still need to figure out all of the content that you have. And then a little further down the line, you can figure out what content's going over. You do not have to wait for a new CMS to do this. So the editorial question is what content is moving? What's going to go from the old CMS to the new CMS? My dog is now barking. So my dog obviously feels very, very strongly about content migrations. I apologize for that. Content analysis. Once you've done that and you know what content's moving, now what we have to do is some analysis of like the content in your source system and how that content needs to change for your target system. In particular, we need to ask ourselves how the content model maps over to the future content. Most CMSs have some concept of content types. So your old CMS probably has your content organized by type, like you have articles and you have topic pages and you have employee bios or whatever, or dealer records. You need to figure out, are you going to map those over? Are you going to create a type in the new CMS? And then for all the attributes of those, how are you going to map those attributes over? Like if those are a particular data type, does that data type exist in the new system? Someone needs to sit down with your existing content model and compare it to the capabilities of your new CMS and ask themselves, do all of those capabilities map over? Also, you need to look at aggregations. A content aggregation is when you kind of group content together, like for instance, menus like navigation menus. Well, a list of content objects in a menu, that wasn't an accident. Those content objects got organized into that menu some particular way. How were they organized into that menu on your existing CMS, and how are you going to do that on your new CMS? And I can tell you the best way to do this is just block off a half day for a few days, and you just sit there with your team, like all in a conference room and all on a Zoom, and just start clicking around your website, and you will start clicking around it, and you'll see things that you don't remember. You'll be like, what the hell is this? And then someone will say, oh, that's that thing Brad wanted 3 years ago that he made and then never followed up on. And you have to ask yourself that question. You have to say, are we even going to migrate this? Can we throw this away? Or if we are going to migrate this, how are we going to do this in the new CMS? Brad was relying on some feature of our existing CMS or some custom plugin we got. How are we going to do that in the new CMS? And you may have to make some hard decisions. You may have to go to Brad and say, look, we can't do this without another $50,000 in budget or whatever. So you have to figure out all your aggregations, how they're going to move over. And then the same is true for all of kind of the special features and functions like search. Search on your existing system, does it work the same way? So search for things and like, how are the results organized and displayed? Does your new CMS allow you to do that same thing? You know, if you have some particular aspect about content, like for instance, if you have a feature in your existing CMS that will generate a PDF download of content that somebody's looking at. Well, that's a particular feature based on content. Does your new CMS do that? You need to figure out how are you going to map that kind of function over. Then you need to figure out how does the existing content need to change? This is your opportunity to clean up your content. And I have some more stories I'll tell in a bit for cleaning up content. Do attributes need to be split or combined? Maybe way back when, you did the name attribute as first name and last name in the same field. Maybe now it's time that you split those up into first name and last name so you can order them by last name. Or maybe all of the dates are just plain text boxes where someone typed a date in. Maybe you need to create that as a strongly typed date field. Now is your opportunity. You're probably going to have to touch all this content in a script. So now is your opportunity to change that. And then rich text, I'm going to have a few slides on rich text, but that's always a mess. Like I'll give you some examples about embedded HTML in a CMS instance is very common, and very rarely does it just work in the new system. You're probably going to have to pick through your HTML and clean it up, and I'll give you some examples. So we've done an inventory, we've done some analysis, so we've handled like the editorial and the functional questions, like how it's going to work. So I'm assuming you know all the content's going to move. I'm assuming you know how all this content's going to work in the new CMS. You have expert developers in the new CMS. They figured out how they can recreate all this functionality over there. Now you can decide the actual process for the migration, like how are you actually going to do it? The first thing you need to decide is, are you going to do an automated migration or a manual migration? And by manual migration, like, are you just going to get a bunch of college interns to copy and paste? And you may think, my God, no, we're not going to do that. But that's sometimes the answer. If you have a low amount of content, if you have 100 pages, it will probably cost you more money to do an automated script for that than it would be just to get some interns and have them copy and paste. If the content needs to be transformed considerably, a few years ago, my son, between his sophomore and junior year of college, my customer had like 3,000 articles and PDFs that need to be converted to HTML. So he spent the entire summer making $15 an hour, copy and pasting content out of PDFs and into rich text, which may constitute child abuse. I mean, it was the worst way someone could spend a summer, but he made like $8,000 that summer. And if you have access to low-cost labor, like if university students are great for that, work study students, interns, if you have low-cost labor, they can do this. But manual migrations are sometimes the right answer. 100 URLs, I'm going to say just do that manually. Beyond a certain volume of content, you're going to have to automate it. Like the example I'm going to have you later, they had 16,000 news releases. This has got to be automated. Hybrid approaches are not only possible, they're usual. You automate big chunks of templated repetitive content, but things like the homepage that are more artisanal and handcrafted, you usually always just have to manually recreate those. I have very few content migrations that are 100% automated. There is quite a big chunk of content that you have to manually recreate in the new system. I have a kind of 5-step process that I've settled on, and I'm going to go through here for you. There's a process of extraction. We need to get the content out of the old CMS. There's a process of transformation. We need to figure out, like, we need to clean that content up. There's a process of import and reaggregation. So we need to get that content into the new CMS and reorganized, and so it all works in the new CMS. Then there's a process of link resolution. We need to reconnect all those content objects to each other because they were probably connected to each other in all sorts of different ways. And then there's QA. We have to go through and QA it and make sure it's ready to go. So I'm going to run through kind of for the rest of this talk, this kind of 5-step process that we're going to do. I need to talk quicker because we're running short on time. We have 90 minutes, Paula, or 60?
Oh, excuse me, it was on mute. You can go for another 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll have maybe a half an hour for questions.
All right, this is normally how we do it. You got a source CMS on the left, and you got a target CMS on the right. Normally, you don't go directly from source CMS to target CMS. Every time I've done a content migration, what we've done is we've exported to some neutral format. So we get the content out of the source CMS into some kind of neutral format like XML or JSON. And the reason why we do that is because the new CMS might not be available yet. Like the new CMS might not be available for 2 months while they're getting installed and negotiating contracts. But no matter what new CMS we go to, no matter what that looks like, we have to get the content out of the existing CMS. So usually what we'll do is we'll do an iterative process where we export content from the source CMS into some neutral format. I like XML. Some people like JSON. You might even put it in a simple database. It just needs to get out of the old CMS into some neutral manipulatable format. What you will normally do is this 3-step process. You're going to see the circular thing all over the place here. You're going to export and transform the content. Then you're going to look at it. You're going to review it and say, how clean is it? You're going to adjust your export script and you're going to do it again. And you're going to do this over and over and over until you get this content out as cleanly as possible. And then when your target CMS is ready, then you really perform that process in reverse. You do an import from this neutral format into your target CMS. And then you review that and you ask yourself, how well did it come over? Then you adjust your import and you do it again. So this is normally how the process goes. We extract into a neutral format, then we do an import. Extraction, you need to ask yourself, what are your options for getting content out of the old system? There are a lot of options, some there are no options. Some systems have an export where they'll export content to an XML file. Some systems have an API where you can have a developer write a script to get the content out. Some don't have either of those things. One basic question you have to ask yourself, are you going to extract it from the repository or from the rendering? And what I mean by that is, are you actually going to go into the repository of the CMS? Or if it's a website, you can just make a call for the HTML and then dissect that HTML. Now, if your system has no API or export function, that may be your only option. The trick is that content in the repository might not be correct. And the reason for this is that content is often transformed during rendering. And so if you get it directly out of the CMS repository, you might lose some things that happen during rendering. But then on the other side is if you get content on the rendering side, it might not contain all the attributes. There might be some non-visual attributes or properties that don't get rendered. Like for instance, if in your content model, you have a last reviewed date on your content, well, that's never going to be rendered to the page. That's administrative metadata. So you're not going to be able to get that out from the rendering side. You really would have to get that from the repository. And then additionally, you're going to have to break this content apart and then rearrange it for the new implementation. I'll show you that in a second. Here's just a visualization of what I was talking about. In the CMS, when content is templated, I'm going to draw on the screen. I love to draw on the screen. When content is templated, things happen here. Like there's often processes in the rendering that changes content. So do you take the content out of here? That was a terrible arrow, I'm sorry. Or do you take it out of here after it was rendered? Because the content may be different between the two sides. You need to do some experimentation and see which one has a greater fidelity. And then obviously, if you take content from the rendering side, you're going to need to manually break it apart. This is a press release from an IBM press release. But if you look at this, if I were to pull this HTML, I can break this apart into 8 different pieces. So you're going to have to pick through the content that you get out and figure out how you're going to break this up to fit into your new content model. And this goes back to this idea of mapping your content models. You have to figure out what types map to what types and what attributes map to what attributes. Along the way, so we're talked about extraction. Once you get that content out, you are going to have to transform it in some sense. The fact is, content can rarely overlay onto a new CMS. It's like the Toyota Corolla engine in the F-150. You can't just dump it in there and expect it to work. Content often needs to be consolidated or split. What I mean by that is, let's say in your old CMS, you have blog posts that have blog comments. Well, let's say that they are separate content objects in your old CMS, but in your new CMS, they're the same content object. Like it just has a repeating property for the comments. Well, you're gonna have to combine that. I mean, your new CMS just does it differently. Or content might need to be split. Let's say in your old CMS, your comments are bundled in with a blog post, but in your new CMS, they're separate content objects. So you're gonna have to break those into pieces. Rich text is usually always a disaster. It will usually always need to be adjusted. You'll have old HTML in there that's just disastrous. You'll need to fix a bunch of tags. And then additionally, in your new CMS, if you're redoing all your templates and redoing all your front-end HTML and CSS over there, well, like your classes from your old CMS aren't going to match anymore. You probably have some embedded classes and stuff in the HTML you're going to have to fix. And I'm going to give you an example here of like this disastrous thing that we did. And you can see what one of these transformation scripts look like. Here's just some examples of things you're going to find. Content embedded HTML might need to be extracted for properties. For instance, in your old CMS, let's just say that like you just typed the date in when you were making a news release. Well, in your new CMS, they're saying, well, we want that date as a separate property. So you're going to have to somehow get that date out of the HTML, parse it out, and turn it into a date property in your new CMS. HTML might need to be restructured. Like in your old CMS, you were just doing like a class. But in your new CMS, they actually want to turn that into an H4. You're going to have to find all of those headings and swap those tags out. White space hacking is the bane of my existence. This is when editors want their white space to look a certain way. So they start hacking on it. They start hitting Shift-Enter to insert line breaks. Or you get them like inserting empty paragraphs for whatever reason. You have encoding errors or like invalid HTML. This is obviously someone that went into the HTML and manually wrote some bad HTML. You're going to have to go fix all this stuff. Now, some of these scripts can get really complicated. And I'm going to give you an example. This is code, but it should be pretty easy to understand. And I'm going to try to enlarge this, and I'm terrible at this. So if this doesn't work, forgive me. That seemed to work pretty well. This was for the National Association of Federal Credit Unions. And I'm just going to run through this really well. And these are all rules that we ran to clean up their HTML. And I'm just going to run through this so you get an idea of how complicated this can get. They had 16,000 news articles, and this was their 4th CMS migration. So some of these news articles were from a CMS that they used something like 21 years ago, like from the early days of CMS. So we took all the HTML, we stripped all the HTML comments, we removed the domains. They had a bunch of absolute domains in there. We cleaned those up and got rid of those. We inflated, a bunch of the content was in a one-celled table. So we went into that single cell and then stripped out the table around it. They had a bunch of spans that were doing like weird things with colors. Then we just got rid of every font and span tag eventually. They had old HTML, they had B tags that needed to become strong, they had I tags needed to become EMs. They had a bunch of embedded style alignment attributes we had to get rid of. They were coming off a CMS called Ectron, which did some weird things with classes. We had to strip all that out. They had encoding, they had high-end Unicode like smart quotes. We had to get rid of all of those. They had a bunch of non-breaking spaces, people trying to hack white space. We got rid of all those. And then we got rid of all the duplicate spaces. We fixed some weird entity values we found in a few of them. And then this was the big extraction of the date. They had just manually typed the date in. So we came up with a regular expression pattern to find all the date lines and extract those out. This was another example of white space hacking here. And then they just had some random things. And then towards the end there, we had a bunch of empty elements because we'd stripped them out above. And so we did some minor cleanup there. And to give you an idea of kind of what this looked like is the script was developed over the course of several months, probably 3 months. We test ran that script hundreds of times. I did it personally, hundreds of times. It processed 16,000 objects, took about 30 minutes to execute. So what I would do is I would run the script. Sometimes I would just run it on 100 or 200 objects, so it would run faster. And then I'd look to see how it worked and see what was still messed up. And then I would go in and I would adjust my script and I would run it again and adjust my script and run it again. I just kept doing this over and over and over again until we got to the point where the content was coming out of the script was just stone cold perfect. I mean, we really got to the point where we processed these 16,000 objects and the HTML that came out of them was like antiseptically pure. And I was enormously proud of that fact. But this goes back to that graphic I had before. It's an iterative process. You export, you review what your export looked like. Remember, we're just getting into a neutral format now. And then you adjust kind of your transformation script and then you do it again. So once we're done with this process, we should have our content out in some neutral format, like some neutral XML files. I think for this, we had a folder of like 30,000 XML files, and this was their content. And it was completely free of the old CMS now. It was perfectly neutral. Then you have to get it in. You have to ask yourself, how am I going to get this new content into the CMS? You usually can't just do an import. Very few CMSs will have an import content feature that you can work with. They might have a very simple one, but if you have to do some very complicated content importing, normally you're going to need someone who knows how to program against the new CMS, because they're going to have to take the content out of this neutral format and write a bunch of scripts to get it in. And this is very dependent on the API hooks that the new CMS offers you. And then we go back to our repeatable process. They're going to import it from these neutral files. They're going to take a look and see how it looked. And then they're going to adjust and re-import it. It has to be repeatable. So what you do is you import, review, and adjust. And when you import again, you either delete everything that was imported the last time, or you just update it in place. So your import needs to be repeatable, because you will run it over and over and over again. Additionally, as you're importing, you have to re-aggregate your content. You can't just import a big bucket of content objects. You have to all put it back together again. It's like a big jigsaw puzzle that you took apart on your old CMS. Now you got to put it back together in your new CMS. So you're going to have to re-aggregate it into new aggregations that are supported by the new CMS. Like, how were your menus organized in your old CMS? You're going to figure out how they work in your new CMS, and then you're going to have to like recreate that. So does your new CMS even support the same aggregation types? And then relational modeling can be complicated, because in some cases, you're modeling both the content and its spatial position in relation to other content. And if you're moving content from one structure to another, it can be really difficult. Like if you're coming out of Drupal, which doesn't have a content tree, it just has a series of menus, and you're migrating to Episerver, which does have a very strong content tree, you got to figure out how are you going to get from one structure to another structure. And here's just a quick example of that. If this is like my sitemap, I have a products page, which has multiple product pages underneath it. And each one of those products has a description page and a documentation page, which has a user guide and a developer guide. So this is my content structure. I have an ordinal relationship there. I have to get these content objects in the right order. So product 1 comes before product 2, comes before product 3. And then additionally, I have a spatial hierarchy. Under each product, I have this little subtree, and I have to make sure all of that gets over. It's not enough for me to just migrate all these individual pages. I have to reassemble them once they're over, re-aggregate them. Once we get all the content in, we have to go through a process of link resolution. Link resolution means that links between content objects need to be reestablished after import. And links can be of multiple different types. One might be what we call a property link. Like if you have an article and one of the properties is an author, and for you to populate that property, you press a button and go select an author object. Well, that's a link between those two content objects. That's like a property link. Another example are links in the HTML. Either you're hyperlinking from the HTML to another content object, or you've inserted a content asset, which is in the HTML. The problem is that object IDs are going to change. So when you get content out of your old CMS and this article is linked to author number 529, well, that doesn't mean anything in your new CMS because that author got a new ID. So logically, you can only do that after all the content is in, because you can't link your article to an author who doesn't exist. So sometimes you have to relax your validation. In your new content model and your new CMS, you have to turn off all your validation rules and get all the content in, reconnect it all, and then turn your validation rules back on. And then additionally, you may have to come up with a mass redirection strategy. In fact, you undoubtedly will. And we have done this on the order of hundreds of thousands of URLs. And the biggest secret, I've written about 6,000 words on this. If you're interested, I have a whole blog post I wrote on redirection theory after migrations. But generally speaking, you need to take the URL from the old CMS and you need to import that as a property to the new CMS. Then what you would normally do, this would be up to your development team, but normally if someone hits a 404 on your new website, so they ask for content that doesn't exist, then you do a lookup against that old URL to find the content object it maps to, and you redirect them. There's a whole bunch of theory behind this. If you're interested, I have a very long blog post around this. Once you've done link resolution, now we have to do QA. We have to go through and kind of look at all this content. You're going to have to review this content in place. And when you're reviewing this content, we're having your team review this, they're really looking for two types of defects. There is what we call a systemic defect, and then there's an editorial defect. A systemic defect is a defect that affects large groups of content. And what I mean by that is, let's say like none of the images for your news releases came in. So you're going through your news release and you're like, wait a minute, none of these have any images. What the hell happened? That's a systemic defect. That's probably a defect in your import script. So what you need to stop is you need to go back to your developer and you need to go to her and say, look, your import script is broken. And they need to fix their import script and then re-import so that systemic defect gets corrected. Those are preferable because you can normally fix those all in one shot. You know, maybe 1,000 images didn't come in, but your developer can just change your import script and re-import, and that all fixes themselves. What gets a little more complicated are what are called editorial defects, when one piece of content is jacked up for whatever reason. Like there's a line break out of place or something that needs to get fixed. That's a little weirder because that's just one piece of content. So systemic defects, QA often needs to stop. Everyone seems to, okay, stop looking at content because all the images are busted. And then your developer fixes your script, re-imports, and then 30 minutes later, you can all start QAing again. Editorial defects get a little weirder, and I'll explain why in a second. When you see an editorial defect, don't fix it. Don't fix it. And the reason why is because if after you fix that editorial defect, somebody finds a systemic defect, they're going to re-import all that content and just walk right over the change you just made. And I'll show you how that gets complicated and strange in just a second. One hint, track the results of QA inside the CMS as much as possible. Put a temporary property on the content objects called QA defects. And when you see a QA defect, just edit that content object in place and add to that property, because then you can run reports on that. So track the results of QA inside the CMS as possible. Keep descriptions of QA defects as close to the content object as you can. The last major thing we'll talk about is the dreaded content freeze. And this goes back to that problem I said before about editorial defects. There will be a period of time where you need to cease content creation and editing, or you need to duplicate edits in two systems. So there's going to be a point where you're going to tell your content team, okay, stop adding and editing content in the old CMS. We need 3 days to get launched on the new CMS. Don't do anything for those 3 days. And if something happens in that content freeze period where they have to make a change, you're going to have to duplicate that change manually in your new system. And I'm going to show you exactly why this happens. So content moves from the old system to the new system, and it undergoes final QA in the new system. Well, there's going to be a point where you're tracking all these editorial defects, like you're noting this piece of content has a bad line break, or this key piece of content has a misspelled word, but you're not fixing those, remember, because you can't fix those until you are sure that all systemic defects are fixed and you're not going to re-import over them. So you're delaying and delaying and delaying. You're just keeping a list of all these editorial defects. Well, at some point, you have to go in and fix all those. And that's the point where you have to tell everybody, stop working with content. We need 3 days to fix all our minor editorial issues and get launched. And then we can go back to cleaning up content. Because once content is manually corrected in the new system, it can't be easily changed in the new system, in the existing system. So if you fix a problem with an imported article or news release or whatever, and then they change that content in the old system, you're going to have to just either duplicate that edit in the new system, or you're going to have to re-import over it. Because the migration cycle is very iterative. You have your source CMS and you're doing this iterative process of import, review, and adjust over and over and over again. While this is happening, while this kind of process is turning in the middle here, everything in here is disposable. Don't change anything there, because if you correct a systemic defect, you're going to import over it and wipe out everything that's already been imported. So while this is happening in the middle, don't keep track of editorial defects, but don't fix them. After you hit the limits of your automated migration, like going back to this process, once you hit the limit of this big mess in the middle here, you're eventually going to have to commit. You're going to have to say, okay, we've taken this automated migration script as far as we can. We need to just commit and say that's the last time it's going to be run, and then like disable the script, literally run it for the last time. And this is what this looks like visually. You're doing your automated migration. You're going through this process. You're constantly moving content over. And then you reach what I call the functional limits of automation. You get to the point where the content, you have scripted it just as clean as possible. You can't get it any cleaner. There's a bunch of minor, like one-off problems that you really can't fix in a script. A human being has to go in and fix these. So you've reached the functional limits of automation. You have to cross what I call the line of departure. And that's where you say, okay, we're done with the script, and literally disable the script so nobody accidentally runs it again. And then from that point forward, you are doing manual cleanup until launch, and that's the content freeze. Your goal is to get that content freeze as low as possible. Ideally, get it down to a day. I mean, take a morning just to do final cleanup and get launched. In some cases, this might last several days, maybe up to a week, but it's like the worst thing. It always reminds me of was it Terms of Endearment? No, it wasn't Terms. It was on Golden Pond, where Kevin Kline's character has a foot on the deck and a foot on the boat, and they keep getting further and further apart, and he eventually falls into the lake. That's how you feel during a content freeze. You've got one foot in the old CMS and one foot in the new CMS, and you really just need to launch. And what normally happens is you clean up as much as you can, and you still have this list of minor problems, but you're looking over the system, and like you're saying that none of these are showstoppers. Let's just get launched. And you normally just launch, and then once you're launched and running a new system, you go back and clean up. Just a few more slides here. I'll talk about this for a second. This was a big term years ago, what they call the push button migration. There were companies out there promising migration platforms where they can bottle the migration basically as a big macro or a big script. And so the idea was you would spend several months preparing this script, and then when you actually went to migrate, you would run this script, and that might just take 6 or 7 minutes. One company that advertised that talked about the Red Cross. They built a script for the Red Cross that migrated all of their content in like 4 minutes, and then they could launch. So they were on their old CMS, and then their content freeze was literally 4 minutes long until the script ran, and then they launched on the new CMS. What they weren't telling everybody is that that 4-minute script took like 18 months and $7 million to develop. And so this is the idea of a push button migration. The preparation for that script run might take months. It's only possible with automation. It's very, very expensive. Manageability. The reason why I bring this up is because a lot of people, their migrations get very, very complicated, and they half-ass it. Like they have all these random scripts lying around, and the migration to them is just like this extra thing. Understand that as an automated migration becomes more complicated, script management becomes a bigger and bigger problem. And the reason for this is because the person that's writing your script probably just wrote this really like half-assed script they just run every once in a while, and they're like the only person that knows about it. You really have to get a predictable repeatability of iterations. The only way the iterating over the import review adjust and export review adjust works is if you can predictably it's very predictable what's going to come out, because you have to make small adjustments and then run it again. What you want to avoid is a very, very confusing mess of one-off scripts and one person who knows how it all works. The fact is, the migration scripting is just as important to an implementation as anything else. In fact, in some situations, it's the most important code in the project. I worked a large-scale migration project. We had migrated a hospital. We had one developer in the entire 7-month project. All he worked on was migration scripting. He didn't touch anything else. In fact, he knew for that 7 months, he was working on a migration script that was going to run one time at the end, and then we were going to throw it away, and it was never going to run again. It was the most important script in all the code that we were writing. And he spent 7 months working on that thing that was really only going to run for real one time. The last 2 slides here, these are just 2 random points at the end here. Be very clear on migration timing. Just before you launch, you're going to have all of your business users be doing QA. Make sure everyone knows what's happening and what the expectations are. What you don't want is for everyone to go on vacation, like right before you launch. Everybody needs to be there. They need to know what they need to QA. They need to know what their lines of reporting are, and they need to know what their deadlines are. And I'll go back to what I said before. Always budget more time and money than you expect. I promise you have not budgeted enough time and money. These things are chronically under budgeted constantly. They always end up being more work than you think. And I've reached the end. I promised you that URL. That's the URL to the web project book website. If listening to me for an hour was not enough for you, then you can go out there and read 7,000 words on content migrations. that's my Twitter handle, my email address. I welcome your contact if you have any questions. And with that, I will hand it back to Paula.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Deane. Really, really great information. We've got some questions a few questions, I think, in the chat. I think you kind of addressed some of it because there were some questions about content freezes and stuff. But Larry, have you pulled some other things out?
Yeah, I think, like you said, I think like Lorene asked the question about purging the old content before migration, but I think you answered that in the 3 questions part of it. And then, you know, Paula, when you were talking about the audit, the kind of running audit or rotating audit, I wonder if either of you have any like the tool, the CAT tool that you developed, Paula, or other tools like Content Chimera or others. Are there tools or practices that are best suited to managing an ongoing rolling audit of your content?
So the genre we're seeing now is what's called DQM, or digital quality management. The biggest player in this space is a company called Site Improve, and there's another one called Site Attention. There's several others, but what these organizations do is they're constantly crawling your website. So they have jobs that run every night that will crawl your website, and they give you all these reports. And what they let you do is kind of add metadata in their systems for the different pages in your website and create tasks for different pages on your website. So it's really an external review of your website that happens on a scheduled time period. If you're using one of those systems, one of those DQM systems, then you could essentially run that every single night. And effectively at any given time, you have a complete content audit of your system. And so people are using those to do what they call rolling audits, where at any given time in a perfect world, they have a list of content on their website that's no older than 24 hours.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is I think those tools and the kinds of things they test for are not necessarily some of the more sort of subjective things that you might, or strategic things where, you know, when you're doing an inventory and audit, where you're also looking for, you know, does this content still fulfill the purpose we need it to fill? You know, is it still sort of on brand for us? Is it, you know, our program is changing a little bit, you know, does this content need to change, and so on too. So I think, you know, those tools are great for catching the stuff. Tools can change, but I would say, you know, you still probably need some level of kind of human, you know, analysis as well for, you know, just coming at it from, you know, understanding your business goals and, you know, what you're trying to do and, you know, your style guide and all that kind of stuff.
Cool, thanks, Paula. And Kevin had a question. Kevin asked, how do you, again, I think this is maybe partially answered this, but anyhow, he asked, how do you validate that you actually migrated everything, that nothing fell through the cracks when the new CMS might look completely different?
Yeah. So this goes back to the theory that every migration is like sort of custom. There is no one answer to that. However you manage to get all the content out of your old system, get that in some kind of manipulatable resource like a database table or whatever. And then remember what I told you. Here's one, if I give you one little technical tip, store the old URL with the new content object. So when you move an article from your old CMS, create a temporary property, or actually it'll probably end up being a permanent property or a hidden property or whatever, that called old URL. And then what you can do is you can run a script or a report, and you can take your list of URLs from your old website and make sure every one of those URLs is accounted for. There's a content object in your new website with every one of those old URLs. The other thing I would also store is the old ID. Just about every CMS, every content object has some kind of numeric ID. Have an old ID field in your new CMS. And so you could pull a list of old IDs from your field. In your new CMS, you have to have some remnant, some way of referencing back to what the content object was in your old CMS. If you do that, you should be able to script an audit to make sure everything moved.
Got it, thanks. And Jed had a question. He said there's a point when you do your final export rip content grab, after which you don't want to update the outgoing CMS site, but it's still up while you're scrubbing and rebuilding a new site. I think, again, I think you talked about this a little bit, but do you have any more thoughts about managing that stage, that, what do you call it? I forget the arrow that you had.
The content freeze?
Yeah, the freeze, yeah.
So when you come up with your inventory of content, and this goes to the procedural question, what you would normally do is you would group your content by what we call content velocity. Velocity is how fast your content turns over. For instance, your privacy policy probably has a very, very low velocity. I would gather nobody's touched it in 3 years, and you could migrate that and not launch for 6 months and nothing would have changed. But you know what, your homepage has a very, very high velocity. So your homepage, literally someone will probably go in and recreate your homepage the day you launch. So things with higher velocity have to be migrated closer. Now, if you script it well, for instance, if you have a very repeatable export script, what you can do is, you're exporting to this neutral format, and then you're importing from that format to your new CMS. Let's say you're importing a batch of news releases, 10,000 news releases. Once you've done that kind of export and import process over and over, and you've corrected and it's perfect, that script, both the export script and the import script, they might take 5 minutes each to run. And so when you're ready to go on that batch of content, you would run the export to pick up all of the changes up till that moment, and then run the import. Now, what happens after that? Well, this goes back to the content freeze. If you're still not going to launch for 3 months, then you're just going to be creating content in both systems. And depending on what the velocity of the content is, that might not be fatal. If you're creating 1 news release a week, okay, create it in both systems and use it as a training exercise. So say as a training exercise, your editors need to create content in the old system and then recreate that in the new system. That would give them some experience with working with the new system. It's not the end of the world. One thing I've seen with migrations is people get very obsessive and crazed about avoiding any rework. And I don't think that migrations lend themselves to perfect 100% efficiency. I'm going to say, and I'm going to say this because I'm no longer in professional services, but no migration went off exactly how you plan it. Just like no move from house to house goes off exactly how you plan it. Let's face it, in the middle of the night, the day you're supposed to be moving, you're throwing everything in the back of your Ford Pinto and driving to your new house, and it turns into a freaking disaster. And we all know that's how it goes. That's probably the story of every content migration.
That should be a slide, Deane. It's just a suggestion for future. Heidi has a question. Do you create user scenarios to QA the content in the new CMS?
So I think what you might be talking about there, Heidi, is just a general QA of like how the new website works. What I'm talking about when I took QA is specifically the migration QA, like how faithfully is the content from the old website represented in the new website. And to do that, what we would normally work with is you'd work with the designers that designed the new website. They would do kind of design QA, where they would go through and make sure that the design faithfully represented the content from the old CMS. But the business users really have to do the content QA. They have to go through and they have to be able to sign off and clear that all of their content moved from one system to another.
Cool. And there are a couple of they're not really questions, but there's a Rolf and Jim both chimed in with that Greg Dunlap published an article about how to use Screaming Frog and URL profile. This is in regards to rolling audits and inventories using Screaming Frog and URL profiler. So there's a link to that in the Q&A. There's also, and Jim mentions Xenu's link sleuth for building inventories. Those are, I guess, do you have any more thoughts about that? I know we talked about that earlier, but those are both in addition to the tools you mentioned. I'm just wondering if there's any like umbrella resource for auditing tools that we can refer to.
Screaming Frog is good. Use that. Now, we were talking about this in terms of crawling your old website, which is certainly one way to do it. But your old CMS may have reporting tools, or you know what? If you have a developer for your old CMS, she might be able to write a script that would very easily list everything that was in your old CMS. So we've been talking about crawling, but that's not the only way to do it. I mean, there's a number of different ways to figure out what content is in your old CMS.
Yeah. Yeah, and Mike asks, what tips or tricks do you use when it comes to communicating the benefits of content migration to senior leaders who may have a low level of digital literacy?
I don't know if benefit is the right word. Necessity? I mean, the benefit is that you can launch your new website, right? I mean, without a migration, you really don't have a new website. And so I don't think you need You don't need to communicate the benefit. You almost don't need to communicate the necessity. You just need to make sure they understand this is part of the project. What you don't want to do is you don't want them to think that like the migration is just this extra thing that's like sort of included or sort of just happens. Like everybody thinks there's like a file import website option. There is no such option. And you need to be really honest about your content and honest of what chunk of every $10 you spend on your new website, how many dollars of that is going to be taken up by a migration. And like I said, I had a project where probably $8 of every $10 was migration money. And just be very honest about that, because we had a client at Blend, a university, their launch was delayed 18 months. They told us up, down, and sideways that they were going to migrate all their content. And we suppressed our eye roll. We're like, okay, sure you are. But they swore they were going to migrate all their content. And of course they never did. And they had staff turnover and they never got around to it. And they just sort of in the back of their heads thought it was going to happen. It was going to be easy. Their website was ready to go and they didn't launch it until 18 months after that because they didn't get their content moved. It's part of the project. It's not extra.
Yeah. Hey, and kind of related, this is a nice follow on to that. Mark asks, you mentioned that the estimating the duration of the migration project is a great challenge. Why is this? Can you offer any advice on how to handle that time estimation part of it?
The problem with the migrations is normally not just confined to one person. You have to involve business users, which is always really hard because, you know, everybody agrees to do something until they actually have to do it. And then they always have something else that they have to do. So, I mean, the best thing you can do is transparency to upper management, transparency to the C-level, communicate deadlines well in advance, and make sure you have accountability. I mean, make sure if somebody says, yeah, we're like, if someone is established, they're going to need 5 people to do QA for 3 weeks. Well, do they have these people sitting around twiddling their thumbs all day? No. I mean, these people are going to have a break from their existing duties to do this. And this goes back to the point I made with the last answer, is that everybody thinks content migration is just this extra thing that sort of happens. And it doesn't. It requires considerable amounts of proactive, intentional work. And everybody says they're going to do that until it comes time to actually do it. And then nobody has time to do it. And so the biggest challenge you're going to have with a migration is getting the organization to take it seriously.
And there's a couple of questions about like componentized content. And I'm wondering too, if in relation to like headless CMSs where you don't even have the option there of like crawling at the end point of it, that you're strictly inside the CMS. Any tips on working with that kind of content?
So the good thing about headless CMSs is by definition, they have great APIs. So it's easy to get lists of content out of those. The problem with really component content management is that one thing that's very hard to migrate is compositional content, is when a content object, a page or whatever, is made up of 14 different content objects organized in specific ways. That gets very, very hard to migrate. And you need to look at every single migration needs to be a cost benefit analysis. Let's say you have 15 landing pages, and these landing pages are highly artisanal and very componentized. And they have all these little specific components that are organized just so. Don't migrate them automated. Have somebody recreate those. You will spend more time, you will spend more cost trying to migrate those automatically than you would get benefit from it. Not everything has to be automated. And there are situations where you just need to be realistic that this content's not going to automatically migrate, and we just need someone to recreate it.
Sorry, I'm skipping through. There's a lot of stuff coming in. A lot of people are saying thank you and having to take off. But let me see here. And if I'm missing anything, folks, feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. I'm just kind of skimming through the flurry here at the end. Oh, actually, here's one. I would. It's more of a comment, I think, but I'd love to get your take on it, Deane. Kevin says, I keep getting asked what the value proposition is for the new content system. This is related to a thread that's going on here, but I think that gets at that kind of stakeholder communication about the value. You talked to this earlier. I guess I think the value prop is sort of that's a specific question that comes up sometimes. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Value prop of the new CMS?
Yeah, of the new, or of the, I'm guessing that maybe it's the value prop of the migration itself. Those probably get conflated, I'm going to guess too.
Yeah, so this goes back to the idea that it's a necessity. You shouldn't have to sell the value prop. If you have to sell the value prop of the migration, then you've got bigger problems. Because if they don't understand that the content from your old CMS that needs to come across, then I mean, you have bigger problems from like a budgeting and timeline concern. So
sorry, this is Kevin. I just wanted to clarify. I think my executives all know why we're doing the project. It's more, how do I sell it to our customers, that value proposition? Because we can't tell the customers that the old system is super fragile and about to break, and that's why we're doing this migration. So it's sort of like, how do you position all of this stuff to your end user as a new shiny object that they're going to like and love, when really it's just another CMS system? What are there some things that are universal about migration that are helpful to be telling people about, or do you really have to boil it down to the absolute detail level and say, well, you get better object modeling and blah, all that stuff?
Kevin, if I knew the answer to that, I would probably work in PR, because that is, you're going to make some vague statements about increased security and efficiency and serving you better and hope they don't ask too many questions. Kevin, I'm sorry. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Kevin, this is David. Are your customers the people that are entering content in your CMS, the content contributors, or are they the actual end users of the website?
I'm less concerned about the people entering content. They sort of have to do this new system.
I'd say the customer, the true customer, doesn't even know, right? Well, or they shouldn't. It should be transparent to them.
Yeah, this is a pretty significant. The look of it is significantly different. So that's they're going to know. They're going to.
Do they have user accounts, Kevin?
Not to access this content. No.
They have user accounts with passwords, then you get bigger problems, because if you have to migrate user accounts from one CMS to another, now would be the opportunity to get your user management outside of your CMS. So you don't have to go through that again, but migrating user accounts is always challenging.
Hey, David, my question on the components was more about like a content reuse strategy and defining that, because a lot of times legacy CMS doesn't really have a very defined notion or implementation around content reuse.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're moving to a new one, there's a higher level. And then when you get to personalization and variations of content.
Right. So these are examples of like
stronger.
Your new CMS has a bunch of new features that you want to use. Can you migrate into those features? Or do you need to just get on that CMS and then start using those features on the new CMS? And I usually think it's the latter. Like, you can't just migrate into those. So for instance, in your situation, if they're moving to a system like Nginx that has a lot of kind of componentized content management, you may need to just kind of get over there in a simplified content model. And then from that point forward, put some new process in place to componentize, or like personalization features. So Nginx has a bunch of personalization stuff. If you're not having that in your old CMS, I wouldn't try to bite that off during the migration. Just get them in and launched. And this usually becomes obvious halfway through the migration, because you realize when you're looking at the enormity of getting everything across, you're like, you know what, we just need to get launched and moving, and then we'll start using that in the new CMS. I think getting migrated and launched on a new CMS and trying to immediately take advantage of all the features of your new CMS is probably a step too far. You'll drive your users crazy.
And do you see a DevOps issue in a lot of large organizations that might have like 6 different installations of Adobe AEM, all on different versions and different developers building different content types? They actually have a content migration issue internally between their installed sites and CMSs.
Yeah, I mean, if you're coming out to a neutral format, which is the model I've always pursued, I don't necessarily say that's the absolute only way to do it, but that was one of the reasons why we tried to get out to a neutral format, is we kind of tried to strip the content away of all the vestiges of the old CMS. So it wouldn't matter what version of the old CMS they're on. It wouldn't even matter which old CMS they came out of. I mean, XML was the great equalizer. If they got out of there, we were able to strip them of all the idiosyncrasies of whatever the repository they were being held in. And then that way, the import to the new CMS was, you only had to do the import script once because the import was always operating off the same neutral XML, where the export was idiosyncratic depending on what repository it was coming out of.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we did when we did our digital priority survey this year, the average number of CMSs in a company that we got was 3.
I remember reading that.
Yeah, so it's like they have not only different versions of
I mentioned that in Squirrel
CMSs,
Notes.
difference.
I mentioned that in Squirrel Notes, and I pointed that out. That was a very surprising thing for everybody on the call. Dave Hillis is from a digital experience company called Ingeniax, and they do a digital priorities report, which they just released for 2020, and it's absolutely worth reading. I will trust Dave to put the link to it in the chat. And one of the things that they found is that the average organization has like 3 different CMSs. So if you're coming out of 3 different CMSs and consolidating, then the idea of getting your content out to a neutral format has even more value, because that neutral format becomes the great equalizer.
Yeah, well said.
Hey, I had one quick question, Deane. A couple people had asked, mentioned things about redirects and htaccess and other methods of doing that. I'm just wondering how often it's possible to replicate, URL structure in a migration, and how often you just have to bite the bullet and change and do redirects.
I have never replicated a URL structure. I've never done it. I'm not saying you couldn't do it, but most CMSs, the URL structure is usually based on the content structure inside the CMS, and that usually changes remarkably from one CMS to another. Now, we did have an organization come to us once and said, nope, we have to have the same URLs. And so we did manage to hack our way into the new CMS to get the URLs to be the same. But that's just losing sight of the forest for the trees. I mean, you're doing a lot of work when redirections are pretty good. I mean, I've redirected sites of 100,000 URLs, and Google was completely transitioned in a week, and they didn't lose any search engine positioning. And we were logging all redirects. And I mean, the redirect system, as somebody put the blog post in the chat, and thank you for whoever did that. But the redirect system that I described, how we were doing redirects, worked very, very well. And so I don't think it's worth it. I think it's very short-sighted to try to hack your new CMS to support your old URLs. You're going to run into a bunch of problems down the road with that. Just bite the bullet, embrace the new way your new CMS handles the URLs, and redirect.
Got it, thanks. Paula, we're getting pretty close to time. Did you want to, you had a couple things you wanted to say, I know, before we wrap up.
Yeah, well, again, thank you again, Deane. Thanks for sharing all of the other resources as well. For anyone here who thinks it would be really helpful for their coworkers or their bosses or their friends to watch this talk, we did record it. So we'll have it up on our YouTube channel in, a few days. And I would strongly suggest you, share that with the people who you're working with if you're working on these kinds of projects. And of course,
7 years from now, Paula, I fully expect to be invited back.
It's sort of the rolling Deane Barker talk. And of course, buy all his books. Join us here next month. We are going to have someone from Microsoft named Erica Jorgensen. Some of you will know her, the local folks anyway. And she's going to be talking about content testing. So that should be a really interesting talk as well. And as I said, we've got Margot Bloomstein coming up. We've got Kevin Nichols coming up, a bunch of great other events. So do, keep an eye on our meetup page or our Twitter feed or Slack channel. Join us on the Slack channel. We'd love to see you all back. Especially thank you for those of you who are calling in from Florida or Germany or other time zones. We really appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much, and good night.